Kalos. No quips, let's just get this started. Voila, Viola. Okay, I lied. Vivillon is not a bad Pokemon, especially this early in the game, considering it does have very good special attacking stats, at least 90 point. It is very good. Yes, overall her team is not terrible, especially for this point in the game, but the 90 base special attack is heavily undermined by the fact that Infestation is such a weak move. It has incredibly low base power, and Surskit is just a weak Pokemon in general. Up next, we have Grant, and this is where things do get a little interesting, mostly because of Amora. It is extremely strong for this point in the game because of Refrigerate. This is a 30% base power boost to the move Takedown, which doesn't mean now it actually is an Ice-type move, so now it is actually receiving Stab. This makes the base power post-stab effectively 175.5. That is almost as powerful as a stab-boosted Blizzard's base power. That's as strong as moves like Outrage, being boosted by Stab, Fire Blast, Hydro Pump. These are incredibly powerful moves, and this move doesn't mess around by this point in the game. One of the reasons why this actually is a bit of a hard fight is because really by this point in the game, not much really resists Ice that is available, and his Pokemon are actually quite good for this point in the game. The fossils are not generally good later on, but early game, they do actually have superb stats. There's almost no moves in the entire game that can actually rival this thing's base power. On top of that, it just has Thunder Wave Tech, which is very good. Tyrant is also a very strong Pokemon. Even though it only has 2 Pokemon, this actually is a fairly strong duo of Pokemon for this point in the game. Mostly because nothing this early game is well suited to deal with the base power these things have, and just the fact that they have pretty good typings. Or again, for this point in the game, not much that they are weak to is available. Karina is interesting. You fight her 3 times in the entire game, but only the second is actually her gym battle. But, of course, all 3 of them are going to be covered because she is a semi-important character. The first time, she's fought with 2 Lucario, and wow, bad moves. For the same reason as Vivillon is not much of a threat despite its relatively good stats at this point in the game, the same applies to Lucario and, of course, doubly so, because there's 2 of them. The moves are just pathetically weak. This undermines the decently outstatting Lucario actually has by this point. It completely strips it of any threat potential because those moves are so weak. It also doesn't have the bulk to really use Power Up Punch all that well. Power Up Punch takes a couple of turns to start snowballing, and those are turns it doesn't have. Her gym battle is actually the exact same deal. Her team has good offensive stats, but it lacks the moves to capitalize on this. Outside of the base 80 power Flying Press from her, of course, Hulucha, which yes is a pretty strong move, until you remember that Flying Press's type effective is a combination of flying and fighting. A lot of things one typing is good for is something that the other typing is bad for. It really conflicts with it and really doesn't actually let it do all that much. It's also quite frail, even though it is quite fast. Its offenses aren't especially high, considering how low its defenses are. It's meant to be a setup for competitive, and it doesn't have any of those here. It doesn't have the ability to do that here. Power Up Punch competitively, of course, was a good move, but it was only good in the context of setup. It was never a pure power attack that was your main damage option. It was to set up for better moves, and she completely misses that entire point, which I find hilarious. And also, it kind of required Pokemon with a decent amount of bulk to do it. In her last battle, the Mega Evolution tutorial, to be blunt, she is meant to lose. So her team is irrelevant. There is literally only one thing you can do. Ramos is a disappointment outside of a pretty decent Acrobatics Jumpluff, and that's about it. His Pokemon don't have great moves or especially great stats, and not a lot of heavy Pokemon are actually available outside of legendaries for Grass not to really be effective against. So their stab is pretty low power. The same actually applies for Clement. They just have poor stats by this point. Sure, Magneton is a very strong Pokemon, but Magneton on its own can't save anything. And if this fight was even just a couple of levels lower, it would actually be a much harder fight. I like Heliolisk as much as the next guy, but it's not great. Next we have Creepy Eye Lady, aka Valerie. Mawile is weak. Sure, it's got the best defensive type combination in the entire series, but that doesn't account for all that much when you can't do anything. Its stats are just so pathetically low, and its moves are not great. Mr. Mime is not horrible, screens are actually quite good, and it is able to take a special hit quite well, but really that's all it can do against a special hit, not really anything physically. And again, its 40 base HP doesn't exactly mesh with its special defense of 120. There's gonna be some issues there. It can do some damage, yes, but it either lives to set up a screen and nothing else, or just fails to the first hit. It's at least slightly redeeming. Her Sylveon is her last Pokemon, and it is only slightly redeeming compared to the rest of her team. It is able to do damage well enough and take hits well enough at the same time, but it only has an okay special attack. It also is quite slow, and it's not especially aggressive. It's bulky, specially speaking, but not so much physically. Again, issue with her Mr. Mime and also her Mawile, the stats just don't really match up all that well. It is the most redeeming member of her team, but that doesn't say a whole lot. Olympia's team is only okay. Sigoleth is a pretty solid Pokemon. It is fast, has screens, and can take hit decently well. It's not going to be KOing anything by any means, especially neutrally speaking, but it's definitely okay enough as a screen setter. It can take hits a lot better than Mr. Mime on both ends. It can, of course, also just do work when those screens are up. Considering how fast it is, it can use those to its advantage. Slowking is just solidly bulky, and Yoncom Mind, that's pretty good. Meowstic, though, is not great. It's fast, but it's frail, and it really doesn't have a good special attacking stat to back this up. It's a lot like Hawlucha in the respect of it just only has one good stat and nothing else. It also can't really use Calm Mind in the same way that Slowking can, because Slowking actually has the bulk to take hits well. Wolfric is largely the same. Abomasnow would be better had Weather not been kneecapped in this generation. It's now not infinite, but it's limited to 5 turns. It's slow, it can take a hit well enough, but it's slow and it doesn't have especially high offense, so it's only going to get off maybe 1 hit, 2, maybe, unless it's going against something that's also itself bulky, which its low offenses aren't going to do well against. So there is a problem there. Cryogonal is quite good. It is fast, especially bulky, pretty good special attack, but physically it is extremely weak. It's not bad, but it's not stellar. And it does at least have redundancy for hail depending on how long the battle has gone or if it has been removed, which is a bit of a positive. Avalugg is the high point of his team, but that really isn't saying a whole lot. It is largely the complete inverse of Cryogonal, slow, physically stacked, but specially not as much. Curse, Gyro Ball, and Crunch are actually quite good, and this does actually pair well with Ice-type moves, especially in Avalanche, but the special defense is exceptionally pitiful. This doesn't go well with its slow speed, and the fact that its special defense is that low means it can pretty much get destroyed by anything using a special attack. It has good physical offense, but it's not super outstanding. It is largely on par with what most walls have, which isn't exactly the most threatening. Now on to rivals, all 4 of them. Joy. Opposite player character, so Kalos or Serena, depending on which one you picked. We're just going to go with Serena here because I decided to go that. And we're also going to be not going between the 2 Meowstics because the 2 Meowstics are actually identical. The form difference is purely superficial. Their abilities and moves and stats are identical. Interestingly, they are not actually fought for the first time after getting your starters initially. They are first fought in the Tower of Mastery, where they have 3 Pokemon. As we've been over, Meowstic is not great, but at this point in the game, it's actually not terrible, mostly because stats just haven't super caught up with it, so it actually can do something because its stats are not as heavily outstatted as they are later on. Not great, but not terrible. Absol is actually quite strong. For much of the same reason as Meowstic being not terrible, Absol's quite good. It has not great bulk late game, but because stats have not super caught up with it yet, It can take a hit quite well, it is also relatively fast, and it does have a pretty monstrous physical attack stat. Not bad. The starter, on the other hand... Okay. Their moves are the best they have for this point in the game. It's only okay, though. The second battle is actually identical to the first battle, so there really is no change. Just aside from levels being shifted up a little bit, The third battle is where Meowstic is really starting to fall off. Absol is holding up a little better, and the starter is at least strong enough. Even if two of them actually lack their secondary stabs, they at least have their primary one. They're okay enough. Next, the fourth battle, Meowstic is just bad by this point. Absol is getting a little better with Night/Access, but it's starting to get outstatted. And finally, the other two starters have their secondary stabs on their moveset. But the added Eevee evolution outside of Jolteon is just not great. Even if Vaporeon does have very good defensive stats, actually having possibly the best stat efficiency of all three of them, Muddy Water is not a great move, and it doesn't have a good special attack, so even if it can actually survive a number of turns, Muddy Water isn't very good. Victory Road! I reiterate literally everything that I said before, because again, everything is the exact same, sans one thing. The starter has a decent coverage move now, but the added Altari is not exactly great. Sure, it's bulky, but outside of special attackers, which it can kind of kneecap with Confide, it really can't do anything. It has very poor stats, and it really can't stall. Rematches you actually fight in post-game, and again, everything is the exact same, except for the Eevee evolution getting its base 110 power move. That's right, in Generation 5 to Generation 6, they decreased the power of those moves from 120 to 110. It did nerf them slightly. The same actually happens to the starters, except that Chestnut does have a 120 base power Wood Hammer. Absolite is neat enough, but it really only helps Night Slashing when it does. And it is still frail, even if it does have a ludicrous attack stat and pretty bonkers speed. It is something, but it's just one Pokemon. Clefable, though, is not bad. It is very bulky, it can be quite annoying, and Focus Blast, in theory, is some decent coverage. But it also isn't the most aggressive Pokemon in terms of special attack, which doesn't exactly pair with coverage options that are not terrible, but it's not going to be really KOing anything here. It's not going to really be threatening Steel types. It can really only pose a threat if Sleep can happen and can get that off. It's not an atrocious team, as at least two Pokemon are capable of putting up a fight, but in the ones before the post-game ones, they're just terrible. Shauna, she only has 2 fights, actually. One of which is actually the first battle right after you get your starters, where she is at default a type disadvantage. The second actual fight is actually not bad. Sure, Delcatty is not great, but Goodra does have some very good moves, and it does have a very good stat combination. It's not the best pseudo-legendary in the world, but that's mostly because of competitive and how hyper-focusing on min-maxing we are. It actually has very good defense for what it is at this point, and it has a monumental special defense, so it can actually take hits pretty well and does have some pretty decently good moves. It is leagues better than anything Helen or Serena had. Funny enough, her starter is also even better than anything they had, because it actually has tech moves. And good ones on top of its stab moves. For what it is, it's actually not terrible, but she's by no means a hard fight. She only has 3 Pokemon. And one of them is a Delcatty. Up next is Trevor, who has actually also fought 2 times. The first one of these is actually a multi-battle with Tierno. Pikachu is not great. It's got Thundershock, it's fast, but it's frail, and Bulbapedia, well, quite bulky and actually decent for this point. Tierno's Corphish is just not great. Second match, of course, he is now flying solo now. And Raichu is, of course, not great. Aerodactyl is not horrible, but it's also not great. Florges is actually quite good. It's not, again, it's not great, but it is at least something. But much like Lashana, it's just not enough. His team is just not good. Tierno's first battle precedes the multi-battle one, But here, his Corphish actually isn't bad. This is because stats haven't caught up yet, and starters have not been able to evolve yet, so it is able to keep up with them on a stat level. But even still, it's a single Corphish, and even though it does actually have some not terrible stats, it doesn't exactly have good anything else, really. Now to his final battle, the third fight. This is just pitiful. Talonflame is pathetically weak. Acrobatics, yes, it is strong, and even though it only has a base 81 attack stat, that's all it can do. That's the only thing. It's just everything else about it that sucks. It doesn't have a bulk for setup. His Rose Raid is good, but it only has one move. Crawdaunt is not great. It is frail. It does have decent power, but it doesn't exactly have the bulk to really do this. These guys are all just utterly laughable, even more so than most games' rivals. Now, onto Team Flare. The scientists and admins, all 9 of them. Yes, the admins are actually all treated as largely elite grunts, but they are still somewhat of important trainer battles, at least in the regard of they are admins, and we do go over admins. Again, even though they are just elite grunts, we still go over them. We're also going to be going over them briefly because we would be here for a much, much longer time going over every single one of them, but also there actually isn't much information on these guys online because, again, they're just elite grunts. The first one has just a Houndoom. Just a Houndoom. Not great. And they all follow this trend. Second one is also a Houndoom with a Scraggy. Not good. The next 7, yes, 7, all take place in the Team Flare Secret HQ. This is what I meant by they are basically elite grunts. First one is just a Toxicroak. Next, Manectric. Next, Houndoom. Next, Swalot. Fourth actually has 2 of them, a Lifebird and a Manectric. The 6th has a Mightyet and a Houndoom. And the last one only has a Golbat. All these Pokemon are either not horrible to downright abysmal. With the exception of Toxicroak, which is only okay, but none of them are really by any means good. And this is exacerbated by the fact that they're all solo or only with another Pokemon. They're just not good. If the 7 of them were condensed down to like 2, maybe they'd at least be good. But because there are some decent things here, it's just because they're so spiral into individual battles, they just don't hold up. Even the grunts of the previous games had 2 Pokemon minimum, generally having 3 to 4. Some even had 5, but it's just amateur hour here. This is why the traditional admin role is actually filled in by the Team Flare scientists. I know it's confusing, and this is because they're actually named, unlike the admins, which are again just Team Flare admin. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. First up is Elena, and she just has a Mightyena. It's okay, it has Intimidate, but Assurance is just not good, and its stats are terrible. Next time she's fought, again, she has Mightyena, and again, it's not completely awful, but it is still heavily outdated by everything at this point. And yes, she does have a Druddigon, but again, just 2 Pokemon, one of them is especially weak, and Druddigon is itself quite good, but that's not enough. It's just not good. Next is to Kalusia and Byronese, sorry if I'm butchering these names, who are in a tag battle. Manectric is weak. It's fast, yes, but it's not a physical attacker by any means, and with only physical moves, it really can't do anything. It can't even support Lifebird's Assurance because Lifebird is faster than it, who itself is not good. Barony is fought next solo, and yeah, underwhelming! Lifebird is weak. It's actually worse if that were somehow possible, and though her Bishop is actually quite good for this point, again, the same deal as Elena. One Pokemon that's half decent can't support another one, especially when it's only 2 Pokemon. Kalosia's second battle is also again solo. She only has 2 Pokemon once again, But Manectric is actually decent, at least for what a Manectric can do. It's fast, has a decent Thunderbolt. Thunderwave is, of course, some nice tech, and a Flamethrower does at least have some nice coverage. The second Pokemon of Drapion is, again, a pretty decent Pokemon in and of itself. It's fast, has decent bulk for, again, that speed, and has a pretty decent attack stat. Her team isn't stellar, but it's actually a decent pair, but much like the others, it's just two Pokemon and they can't support enough on their own. Two Pokemon on their own kind of need to be super stellar amazing to really hold their own. Mabel is up next, and Houndoom is not good. Sure, Crunch is okay on it as a coverage option against special walls, but it has no special moves whatsoever. It's also not too fast, and it's frail to boot. Nothing really good here. Her next fighter's team is of course leveled up, and of course special moves are added. Snarl is a decent option, and it can let it fight against special attackers by dropping their special attack. It does have a nice flamethrower, and Sludge Bomb is some nice fairy tech, but much of it is actually the same. Not exactly super stellar. Weavile is actually quite decent, it does have Night Slash. Ice Shard though is extremely weak, and Low Kick is not terrible, but it's a nice idea. But again, two Pokemon on their own, not great. Then we have Xerostic, where unlike the others, he's actually fought only a single time. Crobat. It's fast, but it doesn't have especially great damage. So its coverage moves are not exactly threatening, and its decent stat is only speed, with not much power behind it, which is again a bit of a problem. His Malamar, though, is actually quite a good Pokemon. It has Contrary with Superpower, which is actually something seen in competitive. If it can get a Superpower off, it actually can do very well, boosting its physical defense and physical attack, and just doing out a lot of damage. It's actually decent in this respect. It also does have a very good moveset. Up next to the head Honchkrow and Lysander himself. His first battle, he's just bad. Minfu is weak, and so is Murkrow. Even that high jump kick is not going to be doing a whole lot, and yes, foul play is nice if Murkrow had the bulk to actually survive a turn, which it doesn't. This is especially because you need a high attack stat to have foul play be effective, which means it's going to need to take a hit, which it can't do. Pyroar is not terrible, it is fast and has a pretty decent special attack stat, but it's also frail, and Hyper Voice, even with stab, is not too especially strong. But Fire Blast will sting. His Gyarados, though, is a true monster. Intimidate, always fantastic. Excellent stats across the board, and a pretty good coverage moveset. It's not bad. But that isn't true for his team overall. It's pretty pathetic. One solid Pokemon, two dead weights, and one so-so. Second time he's fought, his team is evolved. Movesets are identical, save for Honchkrow having swapped Foul Play for the better Night Slash. It's actually a little bit of improvement. Mienshao is a strong Pokemon, blazingly fast speed, pretty good offensive stats, and pretty good moves. It's actually a little better. Honchkrow, while not as hard hitting, it's not exactly a terrible option, it's significantly better now. Pyroar is still but Gyarados, as said, is still solid. His team is frail, but it does have at least some punch now to back up the whole glass cannon-y nature of his team. It's better. It's better, which really isn't saying a whole lot, but it is decent. It's decent enough. Third verse, same as the second. Save for, of course, the newly added Gyarados. Everything else, we're skipping over because it is the exact same, but we're only going to be talking about his Mega Gyarados. This thing is a true monster. This thing has exceptionally high physical attack, very good defensive stats, very good speed, and it will have Intimidate. It also Intimidate when it's first sent in. It's a Gyarados. It's actually kind of good. Look, it's actually really good. His prior two teams were not great. His third team, not great. There's really only one common thread through all of these, and that's Gyarados is good. They at least have some punch they can give, but they're not super threat potentials. Again, aside from Gyarados, which is quite strong, but it on its own can't carry everything. The other thing also is that even though they do have at least some offense, they're not so aggressive that they can compensate for that poor bulk. only really Gyarados, and especially Mega Gyarados, can do that. Gyarados really is his only true good Pokemon. The other thing also was that you have a Mega yourself. I didn't consider them in prior fights because other trainers don't have them, and I'm only considering them for fights like this. These do curb him to a degree, though a problem is the limited availability of Megas in this game, so not a whole lot of them actually are available. Kanto starters, Lucario, but again, you have a Lucario. You are forced to have the Mega Lucario. Not saying you're going to use it, but the game does at least have many ways of beating it, even though it is quite strong. And even not including them, yes, Gyarados is very strong, but it still can be chipped down rather easily because his team does not put up much of a fight, aside from a hit here or there by the others, so it's pretty easy to go into him with a huge advantage of overwhelming numbers, which will gradually wear Gyarados down. Now, we're on to the Elite Four.